Uh, We are ahead of schedule, but I do see that Ann is here, and if she's ready, I think we could go ahead and have your presentation and then would take our break, if that's all right. Thank you again. This is our agenda item number 4, or is numbered 4. It's funding the WSBA, details of the current funding and program structure of WSBA. This was a follow-up question that came up from the last meeting by members wanting to have a little more detail. While we greatly appreciated the presentations by each of the department heads here at the bar. Thank you, Ann, for returning, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Mary. Let's see if I can do this. So our topic is the funding and program structure of the bar, and they're slightly different, so I'd like to address each in turn.
Thank you.
We do have a handout, and we can spend some time going through that. So as I mentioned in the overview of finances last time, we budget by fund, and we'll go through each of these in a little more depth today. The general fund is principally funded by license fees and regulatory fees, and that under the rubric of the general fund are almost all of our programs and services to the public. It's the largest of the funds of a $23.6 million budget. It's about $20.3 million. Revenue is almost equal to, budgeted revenue almost equal to expenses this year, and we do have about $3.7 million in reserves. The Client Protection Fund is funded solely by the $30 assessment that you pay with your license fee every year. It's intended to provide gifts for lawyer dishonesty or fraud and use of funds, and that has a pretty healthy balance now of $3.6 million. The CLE fund is intended to be self-supporting, and as its name suggests, the activities that are involved in distributing desk books and putting on CLEs are funded in that separately in that fund. And then lastly, the Sections Fund is intended to cover all of the expenses and the revenues of the work of the 29 practice sections. This PowerPoint is also online if you have your emails with you, and otherwise we'll distribute hard copies as well. So as I mentioned with respect to the general fund, this supports almost all of our programs and services, both regulatory, mandatory, and professional. By far the largest portion of the revenue is license fees, but we also get donations from the Washington State Bar Foundation that fund diversity and public service programs, and we do collect fees on the admission side to get into practice in Washington, MCLE, licensing and other assorted services that may come up during the year. It also includes advertising and sponsorships in the Northwest Lawyer magazine. The revenues, the reserves actually have a couple different components. For the longest time, we've had an operating fund reserve, and that's $1.5 million, and that's intended to cover anything that happens to come up quickly. In the interim period where insurance wouldn't cover something, we have cash on hand to continue operations. We also have a facilities reserve fund, which is something that allows us to be in a better position to negotiate when our current lease is up. And the current lease is in place until the end of 2026. Then unrestricted will be what we collect or what we use at the end of every year. It's the difference between the revenue and the expenses. Okay. I'm happy to answer any questions along the way, too, if you do have questions. This was included in the brief presentation that we did the last time. Basically what it's going to show is anything in the teal or blue colors, starting with the largest piece of the pie until the white piece on the 9 o'clock side, are the regulatory programs. So most of our expenses, about 60% of our expenses, relate to indirect costs, principally staffing, benefits, and other overhead costs related to the discipline administration, discipline admissions, licensing, general counsel, and the Supreme Court mandated boards. And we can go into those in a little bit. Management and operations here is at 10%, and our fees are allocated across all programs. And then the balance of the 30% are different activities that we do that are professional in nature but not required to be done. And you can see that they're much smaller pieces of that pie. Those include member outreach and engagement, outreach to the public, legislative and law improvement, public service and diversity programming, member benefits like free case law, free legal research tools, publications such as Northwest Lawyer, conference and broadcast services like Clay and Rex here, member services engagement, more outreach work, sections administration, which is our cost to help the sections administer themselves. And so collectively you can see that they're much smaller components of what our expenses consist of. The next slide shows the split of revenue, and that's a very different picture. Basically, about 92% of the general fund's revenue comes from the regulatory side, and so that would be through the license fees, admission, MCLE fees. And so basically everything in the largest component and the other blue piece of the pie are all regulatory income sources. The other are much smaller pieces, and those are from the activities that the professional services engage in, so that you will see revenue from publications like Northwest Lawyer, which would be advertising and whatnot. Public service diversity programming is the grant that we get every year from the Washington State Bar Foundation. Member services engagement, management and operations is interest income on our reserves. And assorted things, but basically they're pretty small in the big scheme of things. I'd say overall about 80% of our general fund revenue is in license fees, and the other 12% would be from the other regulatory components. Kyle.
Go ahead, Kyle.
I'm just looking at the graph, and,
Yeah.
and most of these say category, name, value, but they don't identify what they are. The light blue category piece of the pie, what's that?
That is licensing and admission services.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So would we be able to get it with actually the names in it other
Yes.
than category, name, and value? Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So that's really the biggest part of the budget, the general fund, the client protection fund. And this is a good takeaway just because you can refresh you on what the funds are and what they do. But this is funded by the $30 assessment by the Supreme Court. That's entirely where our revenues come from. The expenses are largely the gifts that we make, and there's some indirect costs for the cost of administering the program. And this gives you a sense of what the reserves have done over the last number of years. The reserves are healthy, but we know from our sister bar associations and from history that we may have a year where there's a pretty bad actor and there are a lot of victims, and that can be drained pretty quickly. Next is the CLE fund, and again, this is revenue from desk books and programs that are put on, and expenses, the cost to administer those programs. This is intended to be self-sufficient, and it is. This group works very closely with the sections. The sections fund, then, you can see that, as mentioned before, it's a board-designated fund. So the sections fund, the CLE fund, and the general fund are all board-designated. That simply means that they can be shifted or used for a variety of purposes, contrasted to the client protection fund, which has one sole purpose, and those funds can't be used for anything else. So this is the income and costs of all of the 29 practice sections. Same thing, expenses are the overhead and cost to put on the programming and support the sections, and the revenue tends to be from section programs, member dues to join a section, and interest on anything that they've collected over time. I will say that this, in actuality, our experience is we'll budget to a certain amount, and we typically, and this is true of the sections as well, typically save more expenses, bring in more revenue than we budget. So this graph will show that the sections revenues are going down, or reserves are going down by about $300,000. That's not what we really expect to see.
All right, I believe Mark had a question for you.
Yeah, and that was a question I had, Ann, is if there's a continued shortfall in the sections revenue, how would that be? How would the bar make that up? Would the funds be transferred from the reserves of the general fund, or
Not transferred, but they'd be subsidized. So it's the administrative costs of supporting the programs, the sections activities.
so? Currently now, is anything from the general fund going to subsidize the sections?
Yes.
Okay, and how much is that?
It's probably close to the $290,000 here.
Okay, and how many years has that gone on?
It's actually gone on for as long as I can remember.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And we've tried to keep the per member charge down, so it's been at the $18.75 since 2016.
And Paul has a question.
Yes.
Yeah, and related to that question of the expenses allocated to the sections, I've always been just a little bit skeptical about those allocations. How many staff members are actually allocated to working on the sections? It's a very high number, as I recall.
Well, there's some dedicated staff. There are 3 dedicated people, and then there are portions of other people's time from different departments. So, for instance, I have an AP clerk whose principal work is to process section reimbursements. The communications team assists the sections, as does OGC, and the ledge work is typically a lot of section activity. And there's also the indirect costs that is allocated to every cost center. And that's the basically cost of doing business here.
So that's the one I'm very skeptical of. I think that the sections have more than 80 people allocated to working on them. Is that accurate, or is it some huge number? I remember. When you say this general allocation of all other overhead, is there sort of a blanket approach to that? Because the sections don't feel like there's that many people working on their work. And I've heard this for years. And a few years ago, it almost sounded like the sections are being thrown under the bus, that, the members are subsidizing the sections, and no one in the sections really feels like they're getting heavily subsidized.
Well, I let Ann respond. I also see Tara's hands up. And I think there's a difference between bodies and FTEs.
Right.
So you can have parts of many bodies, so you could easily get to some number. But when you actually take it back and go to 40 hours, it's a significantly less number of FTEs.
Okay.
So meaning full-time equivalents.
4.25 FTE. And the indirect costs are allocated based on the number of FTE across all cost centers.
All cost centers.
Yes.
What was the FTE, Ann? I'm sorry.
4.25.
4 1/4.
Yep.
Thank you.
And can I ask another question?
One more, and then I'm going to go to other people on the list, and I'm not sure I want to have us understand this, but I don't want to get into a debate about something that I'm not sure is necessarily pertinent to what our task is.
So can you summarize for me the revenue sources that you attribute to the sections? And I just sort of would expect that would include...
Why don't you let her answer rather than assuming what you think it'll include, if you don't mind?
Right. Well, it's the sections portion of revenue from the CLE seminars, working with CLE, interest income earned on the section reserves, and section dues.
How about online sales of materials? My understanding is the sections have never been credited for any of the sales of online materials for many years.
Well, I'm going to defer to Tara on this, but as you know, we passed a profit sharing on products policy change the board did this past year.
That hasn't yet kicked in, right?
We're waiting until the books close, and the sections will see their money in January.
I think this dialogue, it reflects sort of an ongoing discussion that we've had about how we characterize the cost of sections as well as what they bring to the Bar Association. So while it is true that the full cost of administering the sections has not been fully covered by the per member charge, which has been a choice that the Board of Governors has made. In addition to that, the sections have been important partners in our CLE portfolio, and it is true that section programs were sold and the proceeds were not shared with sections until we put this new policy into place. And as Ann said, there have been some distributions so far, but it won't sort of be fully realized for about a year.
All right, Fred?
Are there differences between the sections? I mean, like the elder law section, if I remember, is very small, and then you've got your real estate, and you've got your creditor-debtor section. I mean, are some sections, even on your accounting, breaking even and others
Yes.
being subsidized?
But I'm going to have Tara answer that more fully as well. That's her
Okay, thank
area.
Tara, if you could come to the mic and talk about whether some sections are, in the black and some sections are in the red, and some sections, sort of how that plays out. Is that, Fred, your question?
Very fair characterization. Thank you.
Thank you.
So all the section budgets look a little different. I think where for me this is most relevant, and this has to do with some of the changes we made to our revenue sharing agreement with sections most recently for continuing legal education, is that previously sections had to bear the risk of when they put on a continuing legal education program, if it was successful, they would share in a larger percentage of that. But if it was not successful, they also might realize a loss. So one of the changes that we made to our revenue sharing policy is that the Bar Association bears any losses, and we were hoping to make it a little more equitable for all the sections to engage in educational programming, which is something that we want them to do because it benefits both the members and the organization. And Ann might be able to speak better to this, but each of the sections has to have their budget approved each year by the Bar Association. And I don't think that we would approve them if we thought that they were continually running in the red. Is that correct?
Yeah. And 29 sections vary. Some are very mature, have been around for a long time. Some are huge. Some are just beginning and are, in the last couple of years, pretty small. So their budgets and reserves are going to reflect that. Some are very active and put on a lot of programs, some not so much.
Eileen?
With the materials from the first meeting, was this, and I realize this is not entirely accurate, but
Right.
the spectrum of WSBA programs and the part with the allocated costs was not completed because I don't
Right.
think it was relevant.
Yeah.
Is it possible, understanding that there are functions of these entities that may slide from permissive to mandatory or
Right.
from mandatory to permissive, but a rough allocation of costs, is that possible, or is it going to be horrific to get it done?
Well, I think that you actually are just beating me to the punch because
Oh.
we have readable versions of those to pass out now.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Would you like those passed out
Yes,
now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm sorry, say it again. You had some? Dory has a question.
I'm sorry, my question is concerning the Client Protection Fund.
Speak louder for me.
Wondering what the authority framing the singular purpose that you referenced for that is?
For the Client Protection Fund?
Yeah.
It's us.
Is
Yeah.
it the Supreme Court?
It is,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
It's the Supreme Court, and it's a dedicated, if you're thinking in state budget terms, this would be a dedicated fund that can only be used for this purpose. And it is a fund of last resort after every other possibility for a person to be reimbursed for bad lawyer behavior has been exhausted.
Right. So I'm wondering if that authority specifically uses the word gifting.
I'm going to refer to Doug or council now. I think it's APR 15? APR 15. Yeah.
I'll need people to respond to go to a mic, please, as you're looking up the rules.
Part of the
Thank
reason
you.
I'm asking is really to get at how
Thank you, Julie.
other jurisdictions may regard their client protection fund, and if there's a thought that it is more in the nature of restitution or compensation or consideration, or
I think it's
if it's
considered a gift.
always ever a gift.
Yeah, the court rule
Julie
says.
Shanklin, State Bar Council. Julie, welcome.
Thank you. The court rule defines it as a gift. It specifically is not compensation.
Thank you for that answer. Other questions? Eileen, and then we'll go back to your presentation, Ann.
And I guess this is nice that it's readable, but it's still blank. Oh, okay, all right. I thought I wasn't clear.
Okay. So what I've just talked about is how we are set up from a finance perspective, which is by cost center. The chart that we just handed out is by function, and the reason that the allocations were blank on here is because it's not as neat. It's not as neat as saying this cost center, we can plug it in. Honestly, our very first version was set up by cost center, and what we realized as a team was that we weren't identifying every type of activity that we do. So some activities may cross separate functional cost centers from a financial perspective. Okay. And that's kind of like in a later version, we'll have the costs in there. So the chart that was just handed out, the spectrum of WSBA programs, has been used with prior iterations of this group, so we presented it before. But we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it is that we do, regardless of what the cost center is, and came up with a continuum ranging from regulatory, and that's required by court rule or order, to mandatory, which may not necessarily be one of the regulatory functions, but is required by court rule or order, and what we're calling permissive, meaning that it's authorized by court rule or order, but it's not required. What we tried to do is give you a little bit of background in terms of the general type of area, the rules that authorize or require this particular work, the funding source, and this is where we tie back into the discussion about what fund we're in. And you can see that most of the activities are in the general fund. And then breaking down what it means under coordinated discipline, for instance, what are those activities? And we can go through this in as much detail as you'd like. But I think that the important thing from this chart is to see that there is a range of the work that we do. Some of them clearly are required by court rule or court order. In all cases, all of these activities are at least board directed. So these are funded in a budget that our Board of Governors approves every year, and in that respect it is a policy document and a policy of the board that these are the activities that we would engage in. All of these programs advance our mission, which is to serve the public, members, ensure the integrity of the legal profession, and advance justice. And they all are part of either regulating the legal profession or improving the quality of legal services. So this is what we do. We don't believe that there's anything in here that doesn't advance our mission and those activities, although things can be done differently, and that's just how we've sorted them. And Eileen, to your point again, when we get a better sense of have we missed any boxes here, and this is always under review, we would then go back and do some calculations to identify the FTE, direct and indirect costs, total costs. Yeah, okay. That's what I had.
All right, Ann, perfect. Any questions before I thank Ann for her presentation? All right, I know, Ann, there may in the future be more questions, and I appreciate your willingness to appear before us and your future availability. It happens to be 2:26, so I am going to call break early and ask you to please be back ready to continue at 2:45.